Good morning, everybody. It's really lovely to have you all join us today. We're meeting with Dr. Carlo DiClemente, who's going to be in conversation with us this morning about enabling sustained behaviour change. And we're going to be talking mostly about strengths-based approaches to learning, sticking to it, and staying with it. Really great to have you here today. I'd like to just begin by acknowledging the lands that we're meeting on. We're meeting on multiple lands today. I'm speaking to you from Sydney, Australia. These are the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Dan is joining us from Queensland, which is Quandamooka land. And Carlo today is joining us from Maryland in Baltimore County in the US, which I understand is Marianne country. So I'd like to welcome any Aboriginal people who might be joining us today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and most importantly, emerging. I'd like to look to the strengths, tenacity, and resilience of the Aboriginal people that are in our audience today, and also extend my respect to all First Nations people from around the world today. So welcome, everybody. We hope you really enjoy today's webinar. Please give us your questions. We'll be asking Carlo a couple of questions first, but you guys are really welcome to, you'll see a chat box at the bottom of our screen. At any point, you're welcome to add some questions there. And hopefully at the end, we'll have some time to look at those and ask them directly to Carlo. All right, so first of all, I'd like to introduce Carlo. I'm delighted to have Carlo here speaking with us today. Carlo is, Professor DiClemente is the co-developer of the TTM model of behaviour change. And this is a model that's been around for all of my lifetime. I learned it as a psych student in first year at uni. And I kind of looked at that pre-contemplation stage and put chocolate in there. And it's oscillated wildly between pre-contemplation and contemplation all my life and never moved beyond it. So perhaps today is a practical opportunity for me maybe to do better than that. Carlo is the author of numerous peer-reviewed publications on motivation and behaviour change with a variety of health and addictive behaviours. He's conducted funded research for over 40 years with funding from National Institutes of Health in the USA, SAMHSA and its foundations. His most recent book, Addiction and Change, How Addictions Develop and Addicted People Recover, was published in 2018. And this is the book here, and I strongly suggest that you read it. He's co-authored several professional books, The Trans-Theoretical Model, Substance Abuse Treatment and the Stages of Change, and Group Treatment for Substance Abuse, which is a great resource for our work, working with groups, and a self-help book called Changing for Good. Carlo's received numerous awards for his work, and this is just a very modest sample of those. He's received the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation American Society of Addictive Medicine Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies Award, as well as a presidential citation from the American Psychological Association. In 2019, he received the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism Award. And in 2019, the Alfred Wellner Lifetime Achievement Award by the National Register of Health Services Psychologists in the States. Dr. Carlo DiClemente received his doctorate in psychology at the University of Rhode Island and currently directs several training centers in Maryland around tobacco, HIV, and other community resources. We'll put at the end of this a list of additional information, and I'd really encourage you to kind of look through it. And there's also a web page connected with Carlo that's an excellent resource and something that you might want to look to as well. So without further ado, a huge welcome to Carlo. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's lovely.
Well, thank you.
Welcome. And I'd also like to introduce you guys to my lovely colleague, Dan Raffell, who's in Queensland. Dan, did you want to say hello to the crowd today?
Yeah, hello everybody. If we haven't had the pleasure so far, my name's Dan. I'm one of the National Programme Managers and Trainers at Smart Recovery Australia. So a modest team of, well, it used to be 7 and 9 now, so it keeps us busy. Yeah.
All right, well, welcome everybody. We'll kick on with questions. Carlo, feel free to tell us what you want, when you want, and people out there, please give us your questions. We'd love them. So the first thing we wanted to ask you, Carlo, is that, what led you and James Prohaska to come up with the TTM as a process of behaviour change? And that was almost 40 years ago.
Yeah, as you saw, as you mentioned, I was at the University of Rhode Island. So I was there while Jim was doing a book on integrative psychotherapy, how to kind of find the key processes of change that might be across the different treatments. Both he and I were always amazed by the research, because if you look at the psychotherapy research, if you look at people who are waitlist controls and you compare those to active treatment, active treatments always work. But when you try to pit two, we used to call it the horse race studies, when you pit two of these against one another, they both do better than no treatment control, but most often they don't do better than one another. And so we were kind of thinking, well, maybe that means that there's some common principles of change. And Marv Goldfried was also kind of thinking about that at the same time. And so Jim was working on identifying key processes of change. And so for my dissertation, I actually took those processes, made them into a questionnaire, and talked to smokers and tried to kind of find out if people who quit smoking used these processes and which ones they found most important. As we kind of looked for the processes and I start talking to people, people start asking me, when do you mean? Do you mean before I actually went into a treatment program? You mean before I actually quit? You mean now that I've quit? So I realized that you can't think about the mechanisms of change or the processes of change unless you think about them in the context of a larger process. And so we then kind of got together after the dissertation, and luckily I had a sample that quit on their own. So most of the research on the trans-theoretical model in the initial phases was really about people who quit on their own.
Okay.
So people who, because NCI was very interested because at that point they were saying, you know, how is it that our treatments have a very difficult time getting people to quit, and 95% of the people who quit actually quit on their own. And so they said, we want to study this phenomenon. And so luckily we had some data and started studying it. And that's the blending of the stages and the processes are what helped create the trans-theoretical model.
Fantastic. Can you tell us about your earliest thinking in relation to the model? What exactly did you mean by the term trans-theoretical?
So the whole idea is that the basic principles of change come from different theories of therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So that was Jim's work trying to kind of ferret out certain key processes of change. And he identified 5 key processes and tried to do that. And I operationalized them in my research. So from the beginning, the idea was taking ideas from a lot of the different theories of therapy and trying to help us understand the process of change instead of trying to understand the therapy process.
Yes.
And that was, I think, the big difference, because we were not looking at the therapy, we were looking at the process.
Okay. So since the time when the model was first imagined, what else has changed in relation to that?
Wow. Well, lots of things have changed. When I came into this field, you had to bring motivation to treatment.
Yes.
So people threw people out of treatment. If you weren't motivated, they either confronted you or told you to go on your way. They would give you behavioral things to do, like do 90 meetings in 90 days.
Yeah.
And if you didn't do 90 meetings in 90 days, you were not motivated. And so they wouldn't treat you. So I think, you know, and even the first times I presented the model to some of my colleagues in Houston, the concern was that we were soft on abstinence. that we were looking at this process of change, but we weren't really kind of demanding people to be abstinent from the very first moment, and that they needed to do that. And that we were kind of undermining motivation instead of understanding motivation.
Mm-hmm.
So we've changed a lot. I mean, if you think, I mean, even AA now uses stages of change talk, and Hazelden does that. And so people have kind of changed the way they think about things. And then we've had an explosion of research, research into the neuroscience to try and understand more how the brain works and how addictions work. And so I've added that in. If you think about the book that I did, it's really the stages of initiation. So we can think about how people get into addictions as well as how people get out of them into recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you think about that, then you have to understand, well, what happens in action and maintenance of initiation is that the substances start really interacting with the brain chemistry.
Yes.
And so then you get all the brain interactions as well as the behavioral interactions. So things have become, I think, a lot more complicated, and I think we really have a better understanding of addiction these days than before. We still have a long way to go, however. And all of these kind of contributions, I mean, you know, when, again, 40 years ago, it was cognitive and behavior therapy. Behavior therapy and cognitive therapy were not together.
No.
So now it's cognitive behavioral therapy. And that actually fits very nicely with some of the research that we've done in terms of looking at pre-action and action stages. So there's been a lot of, I think, growth and development in terms of the science of change and a science of psychology.
Fantastic.
There's just a couple of questions popped up in the chat. Maybe we can just throw them
Sure.
in when there. So Dave Reynolds said, I'd like to ask about the practical use of the processes of change during counselling sessions, ALD counselling sessions. So he works in Tasmania, and we're training ALD workers in brief interventions using the process of change as a foundation for good practice. I'm looking for more practical ways of bringing together the theory of practice of the process of change in counselling group. So I guess it's probably similar to a question I think is later on, is how do you start to practically apply that into your sessions?
So the processes of change are generic change mechanisms. So when we think about consciousness raising or self-reevaluation, environmental reevaluation, these are all activities that happen inside the individual. What we're trying to do from our treatment perspective is we're trying to find strategies that activate those processes in those individuals.
Yeah. So
the challenge is kind of how can you identify these processes in individuals when they're talking or when they're engaged either in group or in individual treatment. And it's been really interesting if you listen. So I don't know how many of you trained in motivational interviewing, but if you ever saw The Rounder, for example, is one of the key videotapes that are shown when people teach MI. Well, if you look at The Rounder, you can actually see consciousness raising, you can see self-reevaluation, you can see environmental reevaluation. So what I'd say to this, the questioner is, well, you need to keep looking to see if you're activating some of these processes. So you watch, and this is, I know there's a question later on about MI and stuff, but this is actually what MI tries to do, is identify what it calls change talk. Well, change talk is really activation of the processes of change. Yeah. So if you think about people kind of saying, oh, well, I need to change. Well, there's some self-reevaluation going on. There's some consciousness raising going on. And so it's always important to kind of think about what's the process I'm trying to activate, and then how does that, and can I see that this person's engaged in that? And the best way you can tell is listen.
Yeah. I think if I just make comment, and it's something I've spoken to. When in Smart Recovery, we would have varying degrees of people coming in at levels of stages of change. But I do find they're in multiple stages of change about different things. So, for example, you might have someone who's coerced or mandated to be there. And if you start discussing drug and alcohol, you're going to continually get met with that kind of sustained talk. So it's about kind of shifting that and understanding their motivations to be in that room, their values. And it's ultimately it'd be something like, well, I want to stay out of jail. So when you start talking that language and going down that path and kind of developing change talk within that topic, you start to see a shift through the stages of change. Eventually, you're building that empathy, that kind of confidence, that rapport with them, that you maybe start to connect the dots later on around and work on a different stage of change with that individual. So interesting.
Another question too, Carlo, asking you to kind of look at your experience of TTM in relation to the development of MI and where these two intersect now in your view. I think that's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, I think they kind of grew up together. I mean, I think how it actually started is I think I went to a psychology conference. I was just newly graduated, PhD, listened to Bill Miller give a talk on the drinker checkup. Mm-hmm. Which was his initial thing to kind of how can I just evaluate and give feedback to people and they would change their drinking. Mm-hmm. And so he heard that and he said, well, I don't know how this actually works, but maybe there's two guys who've been writing about the stages of change stuff. And so we got together, and actually the reason that the model took off was Bill made it the kind of framework for the conference in the ICTAB conference in Scotland. So actually that had immense impact because there were people from all over the world at that conference in Berwyn, Scotland, and we talked about the model, and he had actually pre-contemplation, contemplation. Marlette was there talking about maintenance, and so we kind of thought about that. But the issue of motivation, Bill was always kind of intrigued by the motivation part of that. And so he went on sabbatical, I think 85, 86, and came back with more of his thinking about motivation and the stages. So we kind of grew up together. I mean, he calls us kissing cousins or something like that, but somehow or other we kind of we're always kind of integrative, and I think it's really important. I think what the contribution of MI was, we had identified the stages, we identified some of the tasks, but there weren't a whole lot of strategies of how to really access the motivation of the individual. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the brilliant Steve and Bill did was bring strategies and ways of talking. So having a motivational conversation about change. Yep. And doing exactly what Dan said, not always finding out where the motivation is, because it's not true that people aren't motivated. No. They just aren't motivated to do what you want them to do. But they are motivated, and you have to find out where that motivation is and evoke it, as they say, and bring it out. And I think it parallels really nicely the first three stages. Mm-hmm. So MI, I think, is a wonderful tool to be able to use in those first three stages.
Yeah. And we were fortunate to have Bill Miller do a webinar last month for us. So if there are anybody that attending today that wanted to check that out as well, give some context if they don't know that, please feel free to go onto the Smart Recovery Australia website from last month. So thank you.
That's great.
Carlo, can you just then elucidate a bit, what is the connection between the stages, processes and context of change?
Sure. So the original idea was, like I said, the stages and the processes, that really there was an interaction between these that really helped us to understand this process of change. Mm-hmm. We also found out that it's as you were saying about strength, it's very, the process of change is very behavior specific.
Yes.
So when I think about where is somebody in terms of their the stages of change, I need to know about what. So you can be in different stages with regard to, and we learned that as we kind of figured out, people in action for cutting down were often in pre-contemplation for quitting completely.
Yes.
Okay. So we understood that there's these different stages, and then we studied the processes and tried to track as people move through the stages, do the processes change? And we found this interaction between the stages and the processes. So the processes are the ways that people complete the stage tasks so that they can move on to the next stage. And there does seem to be, I mean, this is from the research, two sets of processes, one more cognitive experiential and one more behavioral set.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of tracks the pre-action and the action stages. So that's really how those two things fit together. However, when you're talking about changing one thing, so we were focused on smoking at the very beginning. I ran an alcoholism treatment center, so we were interested in alcohol. So if you focus on that behavior, people said, well, it only works for smoking. It only works for one behavior. And what you need to realize, though, and why we brought in context, or originally we called it levels of change, was that every change happens in the context of that person's life. So you need to understand where that person is, because so somebody's in contemplation and they move and they say, okay, I've now decided I'm going to quit drinking or cut down on my drinking or whatever. And then during the week, they have a row with their spouse. And then they're back in contemplation, not in decision making. They moved back and they did some things. So context really affects the completion of the tasks of the stages and the use of the processes of change. So it's a much more of a holistic perspective, and it's a heuristic perspective. So basically, what I mean by that is, it's really something that helps us simply kind of understand what actually is going on with people in the change process.
I think I remember reading Prohaska saying, you know, as a really young student, that a lot of people want to change, but they just don't know how. And that's certainly been my experience of watching smart participants at work. What, in your view, though, are the core ingredients of intentional behavior change? Like, what do we need? What's the recipe, do you think?
Well, so I'm not so sure that everybody wants to change.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I first of all think that may be a little overly optimistic.
Okay.
I do think that people have thoughts about changing whenever they have problems or when things come up. You know, maybe I should do something about my weight. Maybe I should be more active. So thoughts about changing, wishes about changing, some of those kind of things, I think all of us have those. Mm-hmm. But most people really don't want to change. I mean, that's not, we are happy with our habits. We kind of get comfortable. We are kind of settled in. And so when you say, let's change something, usually people get a little bit upset. And clearly, I mean, we have a lot of stuff going on in the United States that if we want to change certain kinds of things, and you get all kinds of people. You have people moving forward toward change, and then you have people sticking in and saying, we're not going to change. So I think change is always a challenge. And to do that, how would I change? And I like to ask people to think about your own changes, not just your clients' changes, because I think that's really very instructive. So if I were going to change something, I would first have to become aware that there's a need for change, or get interested or concerned about change. I would have to then do some kind of a risk-reward analysis. So is this really in my best interest? You know, cost benefits, whatever. I would have to make a decision that says, yes, I'm really going to do this. And then I would have to get committed to doing it and probably figure out some kind of plan. I mean, even a very quick, cursory plan is a plan. And ultimately, I would have to then take the steps and do the behavior and sustain the behavior by integrating it into my life. So that's really what the stages identify, are these critical tasks that need to happen. So that's how I think people, now this is intentional change.
Okay.
There are other kinds of changes. So there's developmental change. You don't do any, we're aging. I'm sorry, you're going to be older. It doesn't matter. You don't have to do much except stay alive, and you'll age. And then there's imposed change. So I like to tell people, I can get drug abusers to stop using drugs. I just have to put them in the right prison, know the guards, don't let any drugs in, do all of that stuff, and I can stop them from using substances. But stopping is not the same as quitting. Okay. So that's the challenge, is how do you get this intentional, intrinsically driven change? And that's what I think is there.
Yeah. But I think I've always found it is a bit of a detective work that you need to do with the individual to find out what are the values that they really want to live their life by, and what are the hooks that are pulling them away from that. And if you can start to speak into that, you have that foundation and that vision of, well, this is worth it, you know, because it can be such a hard thing to visualize all this change and have it all laid out before you. But tapping into that value at that moment in time is that important thing for them at that moment in that time.
I would agree.
Hello, what's the role of kind of learning and learning to cope in relation to intentional change?
Well, the intentional change process is a learning process. So I think that's why relapse happens. And this recycling process. So the model always had the idea. I mean, originally we thought that relapse was a stage of change. And then when we studied it and kind of understood the individuals who were in that stage, they didn't look like they were unique. Some of them looked more like they were in pre-contemplation. This is because you're looking at the processes, you're looking at their decisional balance, you're looking at their self-efficacy, and they looked a little more like pre-contemplation. Others looked more like contemplation. So that's when we understood that, wait a minute, this is actually a cycle. So people go back into one of the earlier stages. So it's not important where you've been, it's important where you are. After the relapse. So that process, I think, is a learning process, and I think learning how to change is really, I think, a critical piece. So I would think that what we should be doing is teaching people how to change, the process, and coping is part of that. I like to say that, you know, motivational interviewing is great, but it really, I mean, even in the third volume, he moved further into action or preparation, really, with the planning piece of the motivational interviewing. But essentially, motivational interviewing isn't a complete therapy. Motivational interviewing, if it's complete, it's because it assumes you have the skills to be able to implement the change. That all I needed to do was to motivate you, and then you can do it. But for a lot of the people that, with the lives and the years of being in this particular problem, they don't just need motivation, they also need skills. They need to learn how to kind of deal with all the different aspects of action. How to build a plan that works for them. I talk about a plan being effective, acceptable, and accessible. And if the plan doesn't have all three of those, it's not going to get done.
Yeah, and that's the role of a smart facilitator. It is that kind of coaching, guiding. It almost is like being a tour guide, you know. The person knows where they want to go, You just by which direction.
Yes.
And I'm curious, Carlos, and it might speak into towards the end, a part of a question that Glenn Roden put in about, you know, the exit kind of stage, or that kind of transcendent kind of stage. But when it comes to that lapse, relapse, and it's not a language I personally like using, and I think I've heard reoccurrence or recycling, you know, because it can be a lapse or a reoccurrence of something can actually sometimes be the biggest thing that helps you learn some skills, because you realize that, you know, complacency might have crept down, or you haven't set the correct things around you to support you. And it's like, I liken it to going to the gym. If I don't feel a little bit of discomfort and work these muscles, you know, they're not going to be the strength, and it can be the main part of the strength, you know, as you move through that and learn from that.
Right. So I agree. My view is that basically so moving through the stages, you can move through with different amounts of interest and concern, with a more or less strong decision, with a decent or a good or a wonderful plan, with a certain amount of commitment. So when people go through, the problem is, I think when we talk about relapse, remember Marlott talked about maintenance. He wasn't really focused on relapse. He really wanted to understand, how does maintenance work? And then the relapse piece, he focused a lot on that coping and self-efficacy and what you have to do in that. But I think we got overly focused on action and maintenance, because the recycling could be going back through and getting the decision right, getting the decision strong enough to actually support the rest of the change process. And I've seen it and heard it from people. They kind of go, okay, well, this time, when I said, well, why is this time different? You seem to be more successful. They said, well, I did it different from last time. I learned that I needed a firmer decision. I need to be doing it for me. I was trying to do it too much for somebody else. So it's getting that whole process right that actually makes for success. And that's why recycling is a success of approximation learning. You just go through multiple times. And the problem is that people, when we use the term relapse, it gives people a sense that they blame
failure.
Failure. It's wrong. So that was my talk for the NIAAA award, was on relapse and recycling. Is relapse necessary for the process of change? And it is a kind of it doesn't just happen for substance use. Relapse happens in all kinds of behaviors, all health behaviors. Any chronic health behavior has relapse.
Netflix and chocolate binges. That's what I've been struggling with during COVID.
Okay, so
I'm trying to move through that now, Carlo. I'm trying to go into that maintenance stage now. You know,
get through it a different way. Figure out what went wrong. So I've been reading actually a lot of books recently on errors. I just finished a book on being wrong. That was a wonderful book on why we find it so hard to acknowledge that we're wrong. There's another book by this Matthew Syed called Black Box Thinking. And what he did there was his subtitle is Why We Don't Learn from Our Mistakes. But his model is looking at the black box of the airline industry and how the airline industry looks at a mistake, an accident, and tries to kind of understand everything that's happening around that, not just with the black box, what the pilots were doing before they went into the plane, whether any of them had marital problems, how they kind of got along in the cockpit, and then the technical stuff of what happens with all the different things. But we should be doing more of that to look at this reoccurrence. What's happened? What did you do well? And what are the things that we may need to kind of help you with to kind of avoid this next time?
Yeah, and what's really key in smart recovery, and hopefully as facilitators, we're trained to create support this really this helpful environment to come back even though you've made a mistake, that there's no shame, there's no guilt. It's an opportunity again to strengthen your resilience. And unfortunately there are some models out there that put them in that mindset, oh, I'm back to square one. And I never believe that. You're never back to square one, because you've learned something valuable if you walk through those doors again and feel welcome to come back and to kind of recycle that and learn from it. So that's really key to SMART, to have that positive, supportive, non-judgmental, no shame, no guilt, come back and just talk about it and be open to it.
How does that fit, Carlo, in relation to stick and stay?
So stick and stay is actually a phrase that I'm doing some work with substance exposed newborns. So working with home visitors who work with them, and social services folks who work with moms who are pregnant and with substances, and then also their offspring. And this was a mom in recovery. And I said, well, what would you say to somebody else? And she says, stick and stay, because the first parts of this are very difficult. Mm-hmm. She said, I went through the first 2 to 3 weeks of my treatment program, and I mean, I was not really there. Mm-hmm. And it took me a while to kind of get in there and stick with it and stay, because that's the challenge. I think giving up is the if there's anything we need relapse, it's really giving up on change. That's what I think that is, because that's when you actually stop trying.
Yes. And
so I think, as long as the person continues to try and work with that process, I think that's why stick and stay seems so appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Change as the antithesis of addiction, similar to freedom being the opposite of enslavement. What do you mean by these things, and what's the role of mutual aid groups, do you think, in relation to this? Like, how do we seek consciousness raising within a group? How do we look at self-liberation? What's autonomy and freedom? And how can mutual aid groups support this in humans?
So I think in the addiction area, I think we have a whole sense that people don't have choice. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a real problem. So I think the mutual help as well as the treatments can really help people understand that you have choice. You're not, yes, you have impaired self-regulation. That's part of any addiction, okay? And you don't always make the right choices, but you can choose, and you can work with what you have to kind of make things better. And that's I think the hope. So I think the mutual support is really offering hope. It offers modeling. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a very important thing. What's nice about groups is that not everybody in the group, I mean, if you're doing individual MI, you really want the person to talk, but some people learn vicariously in group. And that's an important learning process. So they kind of get it. And it's like when the AA meetings, people would go, I was in an AA meeting and somebody told my story. It's kind of like, you went to 200 AA meetings. Why was this story so unique? But somehow or other, it connected with that particular individual, and the light went on, the reevaluation went on, the consciousness raising went on. So I think getting the participants also to help one another and be mutually supportive of the processes of change and the overall process of change is really the key.
Mm-hmm. I've got a question from the research team for you, Carlo. When behaviour change interventions are delivered by SMART facilitators, what are your recommendations around how to best evaluate and ensure that these interventions are being delivered and landing well for participants. So how do we do this work and make sure that we actually benefit from this work?
That's a good question, because it's really hard. The only way really to evaluate how well you're doing is to get the feedback from the individual,
Mm-hmm.
to hear what the individual is doing and see how the individual is doing that. So we once thought about running groups and having people have those like they do in political arenas, where you can kind of push a button when you think the person is on target or off target or whatever, that you can actually gauge something and things light up. Because that's what you're really trying to do. You're really trying to engage the individual in the process of change. So I would always ask what is happening to the individual and focus on their experience of what's happening in the group. I mean, there is also the other side of it, which is the fidelity. Is the person doing the leader, is the leader actually doing what they're supposed to be doing and how they're saying it? But we know enough from manuals that you could be very strictly doing the manual and not engaging the process of change.
Sure.
So it really is about the connection, I think, between the individual and the activation of the processes in the individual. How to measure those is always a challenge. I mean, we did in Project Match, we used to have, after every session, the person had to kind of do a brief processes of change scale. And what we found actually was the processes of change, people who were using more processes of change in session 2 actually had better outcomes at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But doing that is a little burdensome, with everybody having to fill out questionnaires and do that kind of stuff at the very point in time.
So maybe it's exciting that we've started to do that work at SMART, because we had some money, part of a New South Wales health grant, where we got to build a routine outcome monitoring app. And the participants themselves in SMART groups actually used this app to kind of notice their own change and to record it as they were going. So I like the democracy of that project. But I'd like to just know about, the best ways to embed kind of routine outcome monitoring from a participant perspective, so that we can learn more and know more and do all of the things that are important and encouraging and enabling change.
No, I think that's great. And I do think that monitoring is really helpful. We did something where we just every Monday and Thursday, we had people report on their desires for alcohol and their change processes and whatever. And you can see changes over time in terms of that, but you can also see that days make a difference. So I think the monitoring, and even the monitoring on a couple of times a week, is really would be a cool thing to do.
So any of you guys out there who'd like to download the app, it's called Smart Track, and we'd encourage you to do it. It's free, and it might be a thing to enable you to encourage your participants to keep a track on their processes of change as they're doing them.
Great.
One more question too, Carlo, about just SMART facilitators and participants. How might the model be introduced and used in group settings in ways that you think would confer the greatest advantage to participants? Because at the end of the day, that's our goal as facilitators. Right. How do we kind of provide the greatest benefit that we can by doing all that we can in relation to the TTM?
So I think teaching people the model is really part of what we all should be doing. I know we do that in the first session for our group therapy manual. The first session of either the pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation kind of groups, or the preparation, action, maintenance groups, are always teaching the model, teaching people the process of change, teaching what are some of the tasks that they're going to be facing as they go along. It was also interesting that we asked people to kind of say where they are in the process. And that's a useful experience, because a lot of people will, typically they tend to kind of see themselves about a stage ahead of where they may actually be.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, because we all hope to be, I really want to be there, but I'm really here. And then when they start talking, you can get a sense of where they really are. And sometimes other people in the group can also give them some feedback about, gee, I don't know, did you really make a firm decision? Is this something that you really did? So I would focus on those tasks and have people talk about the tasks.
Okay.
And even the last time you went through, what about the decision the last time? So you didn't do so well with the outcome, but what do you think about your decision last time as opposed to how you're making this decision now?
Okay. There's a really good question that's just come up for us, Carlo.
Okay.
Do you have any suggestions or metaphors that could be used in order to teach or explain the model to young people?
Interesting. I don't really have something that on the top of my head. I don't know how young we're talking. I think adolescents get it.
Yeah.
So I don't think it really children.
Yeah, so generally smart facilitators start to work with young people from about 14, although the average group is 18 plus. So how might we work with, say, that 14 to 18 cohort, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't have a metaphor right at hand, but I do think that if you talk about, I mean, we've used things like a river and a path and a journey to really kind of help people kind of where are they going in terms of change. And so I think journey and path and you know, flowing down a river or getting stuck in at various points in time really might be a helpful way to look at it.
And I was thinking it from a perspective, Carlos, sometimes just the language we use might even just be able to simplify it. Like pre-contemplation, I'm a bit stuck. You know, yes. I'm thinking about it. I'm going to try it. I'm going to try again, you know, and we do just change that language when working with ATSI groups. It's just slight word change.
Sure.
Then they're able to kind of process that. But if it's okay, I've a couple of things that have popped up. It was a question that Glenn Roden had, and it was something from a personal perspective. I'm interested to hear your take on it. Myself, and I think Glenn had shared that they had been through some significant addiction processes, and he's maybe at a different stage of change than perhaps I am, or whether I'd even consider myself, you know, removed from that cycle now for me. But it is around a couple of things. What do you think the role of identity is, you know, understanding your true identity or how you see yourself, and then being able to then connect with the relationships? Because there is a lot of research around the idea of addiction and it being a connection or relationship, and one of the main things that can pull you out of that process. And is it possible to transcend it, for you to no longer, to see that behavior as being atypical and it's no longer a cycle that you can be worried about or concerned about?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do think that, I mean, that is one of the challenges. And so I think of an addiction as a well-maintained behavior change. Okay. So that basically that's what we have. That it's a very well-maintained. And so when you have a well-maintained behavior, you're reluctant to change it. So you don't go
through a negative. Yeah.
So the end state of the initiation process is this well-maintained addiction, this well-maintained behavior. And it's so well-maintained. What do we say when you talk about maintenance? Well, you want it integrated into your lifestyle. So how do you get it integrated into the lifestyle? Well, you become a smoker. You become a drug addict. You become somebody that's your identity. And so that's the challenge, is how do I shift from that? And recovery now, I'm glad that we're kind of thinking about recovery as a larger perspective. It's not just getting rid of the substance, it's really building back your life, taking back your life. and becoming doing that. So when I was at Houston, at the University of Houston, there's a sociologist who wrote a book called Becoming an Ex. And she was an ex-nun. And I was a former priest. So we had this discussion about how to do all of this stuff. And how do you successfully become an ex? And you could think about that from a divorce perspective. If somebody's always the ex-spouse, you never get rid of that identity. So you never want to be, how to become a successful ex is how to create a new identity.
Yep,
that doesn't have this as part of it.
Yeah, and if I'm able just to share very briefly, I think that for me was spot on. You know, that mentality when I went into that recovery process is that I've got to identify as an addict. I've got to be this. I'm an alcoholic, I'm a heroin addict, whatever it is. And I understand that concept because it's raising an awareness that there is a problem and I need to do something about it. And I guess that's step 1 of 12 steps is just that awareness. You know, you have to have it. But I feel for me, it really held me back to then finding that new identity. And I've never at any point, and now I don't know when that timeline changed. I don't know if it's 6 months or 9 months in that process. How long's a piece of string? Everyone's different. But at some point, even subconsciously, I detached myself from that identity and I'd found a new way of thinking and a new way of believing and a new way of kind of seeing myself, that the old behaviors didn't have any power over me whatsoever. And then I don't even today think of myself as an ex anything. I'm Dan, and I can rattle off all different things of who I am today.
Right.
However, I'm still not stopped working those processes. So what we encourage at Smart Recovery is I'm still going to be working on this. I'm not consciously thinking about not using drugs, but I'm using the same concept to get to the gym, to stop watching Netflix and eating too much chocolate. Do you know that those things become integrated into your normal way of thinking instead of the maladaptive way, so that you have a balance in life? We'll always have things that we'd like to work on. But you don't need to be identified by these behaviors anymore. You're so much more than that and that. So yeah, that's great.
Two thoughts. One is, I had another interview that I did, and the woman who's also a substance abusing mom who's in recovery, she said, "That's what I did, not who I am."
Yeah.
And she made a distinction between that as she's kind of in recovery, kind of making a distinction between what she did and who she is.
Yeah.
And that was another way of doing that, because I do think that's a real important way to kind of move away from that behavior. And why you just said why we should be teaching the model, because all of us have behaviors we need to start, behaviors we need to stop, and behaviors we need to modify. And those are 3 paths, if you want to think about it, of 3, and they're a little different. But what's interesting is with the model has seemed to work for initiation, modification, and cessation of behaviors. It's a little different. In initiation, you've got to do something different. You've got to start, if you're going to keep exercising, it's got to become reinforcing, and you've got to kind of build that, and you may still keep thinking about stuff. If you want to quit something, a lot of times you want to get rid of even the thoughts about it. So you don't even want to think about it. I mean, our smokers who were in maintenance used to get mad at us when we were doing surveys, because we'd send questionnaires about smoking and they go, "I don't want to talk about smoking. I mean, I'm finished with smoking. I'm done with smoking." So there is a chance that process is important, I think, through all of recovery and actually through life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's wonderful. That's great. I don't know if there's any more questions, Ange. I'm mindful we've got a few minutes left. If there's anything, Ange, that you've noticed in the questions section, I don't want to miss anyone. Apologies if there has been some. I've scrolled down a few different questions there. I just highlighted, I think we actually had Bill Miller attend the webinar, Carlos. So I noticed there, and I've checked his email, and it was him. So welcome,
Hi,
Bill.
Bill.
So that's wonderful.
Hi, Bill.
And Joe Gerstein as well here, the with a long history of smart recovery in the USA. So.
I've just noticed one more question, Dan. Somebody said, I'm involved in capacity building across a range of mental health and AOD services. So I'm just wondering how TTM can be related to organizational change rather than just individuals. It's an interesting question.
It is, and actually it has been applied to organizational change. Actually, some folks at Case Western use the model for trying to help people understand about adopting integrated dual diagnosis treatment, for example. So it looked at the clinic and tried to have them identify what stage they were in terms of adopting this new way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
And they did an analysis of where they were, and then they started doing some interventions and tried to kind of get them, would come back 6 months later and talk with them. So I do think capacity building, you do have to begin with where the group is and where the system is, and then try to kind of figure out how do you move that forward. A student of mine at in Minnesota did a organizational change measure, the ORCA. So there are attempts to do this, and I think it does seem to, with adaptation, to be able to think about that. The question is always how many people are involved. I mean, is just the CEO have to be in action, or does the whole organization have to be in action?
Yep.
Otherwise, it's imposed change. If it's just the CEO, it's imposed change.
Yeah.
So you do have to kind of figure out where all the pieces are.
So Carlo, we're almost out of time. We've just got 1 minute, I think, for one more question. And I'd like to thank you enormously for your time today. I think I've learned heaps, and I hope all of our audience has as well. One question though, and I think it's a really lovely question to finish with, is like, just what is the impact of stigma and shame, and how does strengths-based approaches to working with people do the work of enabling change in your view?
So stigma actually contributes to pre-contemplation. Stigma keeps people in pre-contemplation. Stigma doesn't offer any hope. Stigma says this is you're not worthy of change, or you can't change. So the more that's in our mix, the more we're actually keeping people in pre-contemplation or in ambivalence in terms of contemplation. So I think stigma plays a tremendous role, and the fact that both mental health and substance abuse are oftentimes left out of the mainstream health is, I think, part of the problem of stigmatization of both of those. We need to kind of be integrated into the rest of healthcare.
Yeah.
It's a health problem.
What does a strengths-based approach to our work mean? What do we need to do?
So I do think we need to first of all, believe everybody can change. Focus on what are the strengths of the individual. I used to say, I've never seen a high school yearbook where the person in the yearbook said, I would like to be a drug addict, I'd like to lose 2 marriages and be in jail at least for 12 years. Nobody does that.
No.
So people had hopes and dreams. And we need to go back and find those hopes and dreams for those individuals who are stuck in this, locked into the addiction. But it takes time to get out of there. So I think we need to give people time and space, and we need to give them protected time. I talked about scaffolding. We need to support these people. We need to kind of have them protected somewhat and helped to accomplish some of these things. And the mutual help programs and the fact that there are that many meetings around is really, that's the strength, to be able to kind of offer that scaffolding to these people so that they can rebuild their lives.
Fantastic, Carlo. That's a great note to finish on. We so appreciate your time. It's been fantastic to meet with you. Thank you, Dan. And thank you to all our audience. it's been lovely to work with you today.
Thank you very much, and thank all of you for participating.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and thank you everybody. Please check out Smart Recovery websites. Obviously, they're in many different countries: Smart USA, Smart Australia, UK. It's a wonderful program, one that I just absolutely love being involved in. So please, if you aren't aware of it, please look into it more and support the cause in any way you can. So thank you very much for everyone attending.
You and Bill Miller as well. Thanks, guys.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.